Did you know medieval music education was nothing like your school band? How did people learn music centuries ago, long before YouTube tutorials or even printed sheet music? Get ready to uncover some truly unexpected truths about how music was taught during the medieval period, a time stretching from the 5th to the 15th century. Number 10. The concept of composer as an individual artist was rare. Music in the medieval period often existed without a single name attached to its creation. The idea of a lonely genius toiling away in a candlelit room to craft a masterpiece was not the common understanding. Instead, music was deeply intertwined with function and community. Much of the music that filled churches and monasteries was considered part of a collective tradition, a heritage passed down through generations. Gregorian chant, for example, forms the bedrock of much medieval sacred music. This vast body of monophonic, unaccompanied vocal music was believed to have ancient origins, even thought to be divinely inspired, rather than the product of human, individual effort. Its development unfolded over many centuries, with countless unnamed individuals contributing to its vast repertoire through adaptation, improvisation, and preservation. Scholars and singers learned these chants through rote memorization and oral transmission long before standardized notation became widespread. The focus was on the proper performance of the liturgy, ensuring that the sacred words were sung with reverence and precision. The music served the text, enhancing its spiritual meaning and aiding in contemplation. The identity of the person who first arranged a particular sequence of notes for a chant was not considered important. What mattered was the chant itself, its spiritual power, and its correct execution within the religious service. Monasteries and cathedrals became living archives of this musical tradition, with generations of monks and clerics dedicating their lives to its preservation and propagation. Even when polyphony, music with multiple independent melodic lines, began to emerge and develop, the idea of an individual composer did not immediately take center stage. Early polyphonic works, like organum, often involved adding new voices to existing chant melodies. This process was more akin to elaboration or embellishment of something already considered sacred and communal. The individuals responsible for these additions were often skilled musicians and scholars within specific institutions, like the Notre Dame School in Paris during the 12th and 13th centuries. Names like Léonin and Perrotin, important figures from this period, are known to us, but their roles were perhaps more like master organizers or compilers of complex musical structures than composers in the modern sense. They presided over workshops where music was created, refined, and taught, often building upon existing foundations. Their works, while grounding in their complexity and innovation, were often integrated into the liturgical cycle of the Church. They were created for a specific purpose, to glorify God and enhance the worship experience. The individual artistic ego, the desire for personal fame or recognition, was not a dominant force. Humility and service were highly valued virtues in the religious context, where much of this complex music developed. Musical authorship was a fluid concept. Scribes, who copied manuscripts, might adjust parts, add their own flourishes, or even combine elements from different sources. This practice of adaptation and reuse meant that a single musical work was not a fixed, immutable entity, but rather something that could evolve and be modified over time and space. The focus remained on the functional and communal aspect of the music, rather than the personal expression of a singular creative mind. The purpose of music education was to perpetuate this tradition, to train new generations of singers and musicians to perform these anonymous or collectively authored works with skill and devotion. The absence of widespread individual attribution highlights a different cultural understanding of creation and artistry compared to later periods. Music belonged to the community, to God, and to the eternal cycle of worship. Number 9. Early teachers were often monks or priests. In the medieval world, the primary centers of learning were not public schools as we know them today, but religious institutions. Monasteries, abbeys, and cathedrals served as the intellectual and cultural hubs of society. Within these sacred walls, knowledge was preserved, copied, and transmitted. Music, as a vital component of religious life, was naturally taught by those who held the most knowledge and authority within these institutions, the monks and priests themselves. These individuals were often among the most educated members of society, possessing literacy, a deep understanding of theological texts, and a practical mastery of the elaborate liturgical music required for daily services. They did not just teach music, they lived it as an integral part of their spiritual duties. The role of the cantor, or precentor, was particularly important in this context. Cantor was the lead singer in a monastery or cathedral choir, responsible for directing the singing of the divine office and Mass. Beyond leading the daily chants, the cantor also held significant pedagogical responsibilities. He was the chief music educator, charged with instructing the younger monks, choristers, and sometimes even visiting clerics in the intricacies of chant. This instruction included not only the melodies and texts themselves, but also the proper performance, practice, the nuances of rhythm, and the spiritual meaning embedded within each piece. Cantor's knowledge encompassed both the theoretical understanding of music, often rooted in the quadrivium, and the practical ability to perform and teach it. Instruction happened in a very direct and personal way. Young boys who joined choir schools, often as oblates or aspiring clerics, would live within the monastic or cathedral precincts. Their education was holistic, combining religious instruction, Latin language skills, and, crucially, musical training. The monks and priests served as their mentors and teachers, guiding them through the demanding process of memorizing vast repertoires of chant. This was not a detached academic exercise. It was a daily immersion in a way of life where music was interwoven with every spiritual duty. Teachers often passed down the musical tradition through oral transmission and demonstration, with students imitating their elders, much like an apprentice learning from a master craftsman. The authority of these clerical teachers extended beyond musical technique. They were also responsible for the moral and spiritual formation of their students. Learning music was seen as a path to spiritual discipline and devotion. Errors in performance were not just technical mistakes. They could be interpreted as a lack of piety or attention. Teachers instilled a deep respect for the sacredness of the music and its purpose in glorifying God. This meant that the lessons often involved strict discipline, rigorous repetition, and an emphasis on humility and obedience. The monks and priests, through their dual roles, ensured that musical education served the overarching spiritual mission of the institution. They were not just instructing in a craft, they were shaping souls through sound. Their expertise was born from decades of personal practice and devotion, making them uniquely qualified to transmit the rich musical heritage of the medieval church. Number 8. Apprenticeships were common for professional musicians. While monastic and cathedral schools trained many vocal musicians for religious service, the world of secular music and instrumental performance often relied on a different model of education: the apprenticeship. This system involved a young person, often a boy, learning a trade or skill directly from an experienced master. It was a practical, hands-on form of education that mirrored the way many other crafts were taught in medieval society, from blacksmithing to carpentry. For a musician, this meant living with a master, observing their work, assisting them, and gradually acquiring the necessary skills through imitation and direct instruction. Many professional musicians in the medieval period were not part of the clergy. These included jongleurs, minstrels, troubadours, quatrains, and later town pipers and court musicians. Their livelihood depended on their ability to perform for various audiences, from noble courts to bustling town squares. For aspiring instrumentalists, formal schooling was rare. Instead, a young person with musical talent might be indentured to an established musician or join a traveling troupe. This informal education was highly personalized, focused on the practical demands of performance. The master would teach the apprentice how to play an instrument, often by ear, demonstrating fingerings, bowing techniques, or breath control. They would also learn a repertoire of songs, dances, and instrumental pieces. Beyond musical technique, apprentices learned the business of being a musician. This included understanding performance etiquette, how to gauge an audience, how to improvise, and even how to manage the logistics of travel and securing engagements. They might start by helping carry instruments, setting up for performances, or simply observing. Over time, they would be given small parts to play, gradually increasing their responsibilities as their skills develop. This process could last for several years, often until the apprentice reached adulthood and was deemed competent enough to perform independently. In some larger towns, especially towards the later medieval period, professional musicians formed guilds. These guilds, similar to those for other trades, aimed to regulate the profession, maintain standards, and protect the interests of their members. Becoming a master within a musical guild would involve a formal period of apprenticeship, followed by a journeyman phase where the musician would travel and work for different masters, honing their craft. Finally, they might present a masterpiece or undergo an examination to prove their proficiency and gain full membership. This system ensured that a high level of skill was maintained within the profession and provided a structured path for career progression outside of religious institutions. Families also played a significant role in perpetuating musical traditions. Musical skills were often hereditary, passed down from parent to child. A father who was a minstrel might teach his son the harp or fiddle, ensuring the family's livelihood continued. This informal familial apprenticeship was perhaps the most common way for secular musical knowledge to be transmitted. These apprenticeships, whether formal or familial, emphasized practical application, direct mentorship, and the acquisition of a diverse and adaptable set of musical skills necessary for survival and success in the often demanding world of medieval professional music. Number 7. The invention of notation was a huge, slow revolution. Before the widespread adoption of standardized musical notation, music education relied heavily on oral tradition and memory. This meant that accurately preserving and transmitting complex musical pieces across generations or geographical distances was a tremendous challenge. Early attempts at writing music involved neumes, symbols placed above the text of a chant. These neumes were not precise indicators of pitch or rhythm. Instead, they served as memory aids, reminding a singer who already knew the melody of its general contour, whether the melody ascended, descended, or repeated. Cantor might draw these signs in the air with his hand, as he led a choir, providing visual cues for the singers. Learning involved intense listening, repetition, and memorization of vast repertoires. The lack of precise notation limited the complexity of music that could be reliably taught and disseminated. Each region, each monastery, might have slightly different versions of the same chant, adapted and changed over time through oral transmission. This fluidity was part of the living tradition of medieval music, but it also presented obstacles to standardization and the creation of more intricate polyphonic works. If you could not write down exact pitches and durations, it was difficult to compose and teach multiple independent melodic lines that fit together harmoniously. The slow, gradual development of musical notation marked a revolutionary turning point in music education and composition. One of the most significant figures in this transformation was Guido of Arezzo, an 11th century Benedictine monk. Guido is credited with several innovations that profoundly changed how music was taught and learned. He popularized the use of a staff with parallel lines, allowing for precise indication of pitch. By assigning specific notes to specific lines and spaces, he created a visual system that eliminated much of the ambiguity of earlier neumes. He also developed a system of psalmization, assigning syllables like ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la to specific pitches, making it easier for students to learn intervals and sing accurately at sight. This system, a precursor to modern solfège, provided a consistent framework for vocal instruction. Guido's innovations made it possible to teach music more systematically and efficiently. A student could now learn a piece of music from a written score without having heard it performed beforehand. This opened up immense possibilities for the dissemination of music across Europe, standardizing the vast repertoire of Gregorian chant and making it accessible to more people. It also directly facilitated the development of polyphony. With precise notation, composers could plan and write down complex, interweaving melodic lines, knowing they could be accurately reproduced by singers. Creation of complex musical structures became feasible in a way it never was before. The adoption of Guido's system was not instantaneous. It was a slow process, unfolding over centuries, with various local variations and refinements. Scribes and monasteries meticulously copied musical manuscripts, gradually incorporating these new notational elements. These written scores became crucial teaching tools, serving as the textbooks of medieval music education. The ability to read and write music became an essential skill for aspiring clerics and professional musicians. This gradual revolution in notation shifted music education from an almost exclusively oral tradition to one that increasingly relied on literacy, transforming how music was created, preserved, and passed down to future generations. The written score became a permanent record, allowing music to transcend the limitations of human memory and geographic boundaries. Number 6. Music education was about discipline and piety, not just performance. In the medieval period, particularly within the monastic and cathedral settings where most formal music education took place, the purpose of learning music extended far beyond simply mastering a skill or performing a piece well. Music was considered a powerful tool for spiritual formation, a means to cultivate discipline, humility, and a deeper connection to the divine. The rigorous training that young choristers and monks underwent was designed not only to produce skilled singers, but also to shape their characters and guide them towards a life of piety and devotion. Chant, the dominant form of sacred music, was not merely entertainment or an artistic expression. Was prayer set to music, an integral part of the daily liturgy, the opus Dei or work of God. Every note sung, every word intoned was an act of worship. Therefore, the accurate and reverent performance of chant was paramount. Errors in singing were not just technical mistakes. They could be seen as disruptions to the sacred flow of prayer, a sign of inattention or disrespect towards God. Disbelief instilled a profound sense of responsibility in the students. Teachers, often monks or priests themselves, emphasized the spiritual weight of their musical duties. The process of learning music was itself a form of spiritual exercise. It required immense patience, unwavering concentration, and strict obedience to the teacher and the rules of the choir. Young students spent countless hours memorizing long sequences of chants, often by rote, internalizing melodies and texts. This demanding process built mental discipline and fortitude, taught them perseverance, and the value of diligent effort. Precision required for unison singing, essential for the aesthetic of chant, demanded that individual voices blend gated into a unified sound. This fostered a sense of community and the suppression of individual ego for the greater good of the collective worship, taught them self-control and the importance of working together towards a common goal. Life in a choir school or monastery was highly structured and disciplined. Students adhered to a strict schedule of prayer, study, and practice. Music lessons were often interwoven with religious instruction and moral teachings. Teachers, as spiritual guides, constantly reminded students of the ultimate purpose of their musical endeavors, to serve God. This holistic approach meant that a music education was inextricably linked to a moral and spiritual education. It aimed to instill virtues like humility, obedience, diligence, and reverence. The beauty of the music was meant to elevate the soul, to draw the listener and the performer closer to God. Perfect execution of sacred music was seen as an offering, a testament to one's faith and dedication. Thus, success in medieval music education was not measured solely by vocal prowess, but by the cultivation of a disciplined mind and a pious heart, ready to serve God through sound. Number 5. Instruments were often learned by ear, not through formal lessons. While vocal music, especially sacred chant, held a central place in formal medieval education within monasteries and cathedrals, instrumental music often followed a very different path. Most formal music instruction focused intensely on singing, theory, and the academic aspects of music as part of the liberal arts. Instruments, though certainly present and widely used, were frequently learned through informal means, passed down by ear, observation, and direct imitation, rather than through structured lessons with written scores. Many instruments were used for secular purposes, for dancing, accompanying storytelling, entertaining at feasts, or performing in town squares. These included a variety of stringed instruments like the viol, lute, harp, and rebec, wind instruments such as recorders, flutes, shawms, and bagpipes, and percussion instruments. The musicians who played these instruments were often jongleurs, minstrels, or traveling entertainers whose skills were developed on the road or within family traditions. For them, practical ability and a wide repertoire of tunes were more important than theoretical understanding or the ability to read complex notation. A young person interested in playing an instrument might learn from a family member who was already a musician. A father might teach his son to play the lute, passing down fingerings and melodies by demonstration and repetition. Similarly, an aspiring musician might apprentice themselves to an experienced performer, traveling with them, observing their technique, and gradually picking up the skills. This learning process was highly individualized and hands-on. The master would play a tune, and the apprentice would attempt to imitate it, correcting their technique through trial and error. There were few, if any, instructional manuals for specific instruments during much of the medieval period. Unlike the numerous treatises on vocal music and music theory, this absence of written instrumental pedagogy chose the reliance on oral and imitative learning. Furthermore, much instrumental music was either improvised or based on commonly known melodies that were then embellished. Musicians were expected to be adaptable and creative, able to play for various occasions and to accompany different types of songs and dances. This flexibility often came from an intuitive understanding of music, developed through extensive listening and practice, rather than from rigid adherence to a written score. The very nature of many medieval instruments also lent itself to this informal learning. Their construction and playing techniques were often passed down through oral traditions within specific communities or families of musicians. Even in courtly settings, where instrumentalists held more esteemed positions, their training might still have been less structured than that of their vocal counterparts. Court musician might learn their craft from an older established musician within the same household, observing their performances and gradually taking on more challenging roles. While notation slowly became more sophisticated, particularly for polyphonic vocal works, its application to instrumental music was often secondary, and many instrumentalists continued to rely on their ears and memories as their primary learning tools. Practical demands of their profession often overshadowed any theoretical instruction, making an auditory experiential learning process the most common path for mastering a medieval instrument. Number 4. Learning was gender segregated. In the medieval period, society was highly stratified, and opportunities for education, including music education, were largely dictated by social status and gender. For young boys, especially those from aristocratic or clerical families, formal music education was widely available, primarily within monasteries, cathedral schools, and later specific choir schools. Boys would enter these schools often at a young age to be trained as clerics, monks, or professional singers for church services. Their education included Latin, theology, and rigorous musical training, which was essential for their future roles in the church. The focus was on sacred vocal music, particularly Gregorian chant, and later, polyphony. This environment provided a structured and comprehensive musical education, aiming to produce highly skilled male musicians who could perform the elaborate liturgy. For girls, the educational landscape was significantly different, and generally far less formal. Girls were largely excluded from cathedral and university settings, which were male domains. However, convents and nunneries provided the primary avenue for formal education for women who dedicated their lives to God. Within these religious communities, music played a vital role in the daily devotional life, much as it did in monasteries for men. Nuns sang the divine office and Mass just as monks did. Therefore, girls entering convents received musical instruction, often in chant and other sacred vocal forms. These institutions could foster high levels of musical literacy and performance among their residents. Figures like Hildegard von Bingen, a 12th century abbess, visionary, and composer, are prime examples of the profound musical knowledge and creativity that could flourish within the walls of a convent. Her extensive body of monophonic sacred music, including hymns and sequences, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of melodic construction and theological expression. Outside of convents, formal music education for girls was much rarer. Girls from noble families might receive some musical instruction within their own households, learning to sing secular songs, play instruments like the harp or lute, or participate in courtly entertainments. This instruction would typically be provided by a tutor or a resident musician, and it was often focused on skills considered appropriate for a noblewoman, accomplishments that could entertain, provide social graces, and possibly attract a suitable husband. For girls from lower social strata, musical learning was almost entirely informal, passed down within families or communities, focusing on folk songs, lullabies, and practical music for daily life or celebration. The differing roles assigned to men and women in medieval society directly influenced their musical opportunities. Men were primarily responsible for public worship and official church functions, which demanded a highly trained male choir. Women's roles, even within religious life, were often more confined to private devotion or within the cloister. The exclusion of women from public liturgical roles, which often involved singing, meant that the specialized training offered in cathedral choir schools was not deemed necessary or appropriate for them. The gender segregation in music education was a reflection of the broader societal norms and the distinct pathways available to men and women in medieval life. Number 3. Rote learning and oral tradition were dominant. Before the widespread development of precise musical notation, the primary way music was learned and passed down in the medieval period was through oral tradition and extensive rote memorization. This reliance on memory was not unique to music. It was a cornerstone of education in a time when books were rare and literacy was not universal. For music, it meant that countless hours were spent listening, repeating, and internalizing melodies and texts. In monasteries and cathedral schools, young choristers and aspiring monks would learn the vast repertoire of Gregorian chant by ear. A senior monk or cantor would sing a phrase, and the students would imitate it, repeating it until it was firmly etched in their memory. This process involved not only remembering the sequence of pitches and rhythms, but also the precise pronunciation of the Latin text and the subtle inflections that conveyed the spiritual meaning of the chant. The physical space of the choir, with its echoes and resonant acoustics, was the classroom, and the voices of the master and older students were the primary teaching tools. Early forms of notation, such as neumes, were not prescriptive, but rather mnemonic. These squiggles above the text of a chant served as reminders to singers who already knew the melody. They might indicate the general direction of a melodic phrase, up, down, or flat, but they did not specify exact pitches or durations. A singer had to have the chant already in their memory for the neumes to be useful. This system worked well within a localized community, where a living tradition could be passed directly from one generation of singers to the next. However, it made it incredibly difficult to accurately transmit complex music over long distances or across centuries without a continuous lineage of teachers and students. Variations inevitably crept into the repertoire from one region to another. The demanding nature of rote learning instilled remarkable memory skills in medieval musicians. They were expected to recall hundreds, if not thousands, of chants for the daily cycle of worship. This continuous process of memorization and performance was not just about technical skill. It was also a spiritual exercise, requiring intense focus and devotion. The absence of precise notation meant that an element of improvisation and subtle variation was inherent in performance. While the core melody of a chant was fixed by tradition, individual singers or cantors might add slight embellishments or interpret rhythmic nuances in their own way within accepted boundaries. The slow shift towards more precise notation, as pioneered by figures like Guido of Arezzo, gradually lessened the absolute reliance on rote memorization. With the introduction of the staff and fixed pitch notation, it became possible to write down music that could be accurately performed by someone who had never heard it before. This transformation was revolutionary, enabling the standardization of chant and, crucially, the development of complex polyphonic music, where multiple independent melodic lines needed to be precisely coordinated. However, for a significant portion of the medieval period, especially its earlier centuries, the human memory, honed through rigorous repetition and oral transmission, remained the most vital tool in medieval music education. Number 2. Music was a core part of the quadrivium. In the medieval university curriculum, education was structured around the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 main categories, the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium focused on the arts of language, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, logic. Once a student had mastered these foundational subjects, they progressed to the quadrivium, which encompassed the mathematical arts, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and, surprisingly to modern sensibilities, music. This placement reveals a fundamental difference in how music was understood in the medieval world compared to today. Music was not primarily viewed as an art form based on emotion or self-expression, but rather as a rigorous, scientific, and philosophical discipline deeply intertwined with mathematics and the natural order of the cosmos. The intellectual framework for this understanding largely came from ancient Greek philosophers like Pythagoras and Plato, and later, the Roman philosopher Boethius. Boethius's seminal 6th century treatise, De Institutione Musica, The Fundamentals of Music, became the standard textbook for music theory throughout the medieval period. This work systematically explored the mathematical ratios that underpin musical intervals, such as the octave 1-2, the perfect 5th 2-3, and the perfect 4th 3-4. For medieval scholars, these precise mathematical relationships were evidence of a divine order present in the universe. Music was seen as a reflection of this cosmic harmony. Boethius outlined 3 categories of music: musica mundana, musica humana, and musica instrumentalis, musica mundana, or music of the spheres, referred to the inaudible harmony created by the movements of celestial bodies. The idea was that the planets, in their precise orbits, generated a perfect divine symphony. Musica humana was the harmony found within the human being, the balance between body and soul, reason and emotion. It was believed that a well-ordered soul vibrated in harmony with the cosmos. Finally, musica instrumentalis referred to the actual music produced by voices and instruments, the audible sounds we recognize as music. For a medieval scholar, musica instrumentalis was merely the lowest earthly manifestation of a much grander, universal musical order. Therefore, studying music in the quadrivium was primarily a theoretical pursuit. Students were expected to understand the mathematical principles of intervals, scales, and modes, to classify different types of music, and to grasp the philosophical implications of musical harmony. They would analyze the works of Boethius and other theorists, exploring the relationship between numbers and sound. This theoretical emphasis often meant that practical performance skills were secondary. A scholar might be highly educated in music theory without necessarily being a skilled singer or instrumentalist. The focus was on the intellectual understanding of music as a reflection of divine order and cosmic structure. This academic approach to music elevated it to the status of a foundational science, essential for understanding the universe itself. This intellectual framework shaped medieval education and instilled in students a profound respect for the mathematical and philosophical underpinnings of sound. Number 1. Monasteries and cathedrals were the main schools. In the medieval period, access to formal education was not widespread as it is today with public school systems. Instead, the primary centers of learning, where most scholarly pursuits and organized instruction took place, were deeply embedded within religious institutions, monasteries, abbeys, and cathedrals. These places were not just houses of worship or spiritual retreats. They were also vital hubs for the preservation of knowledge, the copying of manuscripts, and the education of the next generation of clergy and scholars. Music, as an absolutely central component of medieval religious life, was therefore inextricably linked to these sacred spaces. Monasteries, with their daily round of prayer and liturgical services, required highly skilled musicians to perform the vast repertoire of Gregorian chant and later more complex polyphonic works. Young boys, often referred to as oblates or choristers, would enter monastic schools or cathedral choir schools at a young age, sometimes as young as 7 or 8. Their education was comprehensive, encompassing not only religious instruction in Latin, the language of the church, and scholarship, but also rigorous musical training. This was not an optional extracurricular activity. Music was a fundamental part of their daily life and their future calling. The daily routine in these schools was structured around the liturgical hours. Students would learn chants for matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. They spent countless hours in the schola cantorum, the choir school, learning to sing by ear through rote memorization and eventually with the aid of evolving notation. The cantor or precentor, a senior monk or cleric, was the chief music teacher, responsible for instructing the boys in the intricacies of chant, correct Latin pronunciation, and the proper performance practice. The goal was to produce highly disciplined and musically proficient individuals who could contribute sauce to the solemn and beautiful worship services. Cathedral schools, established in connection with major cathedrals, also became significant centers of learning, including music education. These schools served to train clerics for service within the diocese. Like their monastic counterparts, they emphasized music as a core subject, essential for the elaborate liturgical functions of the cathedral. Choirmaster of a cathedral held a similar role to the monastic cantor, overseeing the musical education of the choir boys and young clerics. These boys often lived at the cathedral, immersing themselves fully in its musical and spiritual life. The significance of monasteries and cathedrals as primary music schools cannot be overstated. They were the institutions that preserved and transmitted the vast body of sacred music across centuries. They were the places where musical theory was studied, where notation was developed, and where new musical forms like polyphony were experimented with and perfected. Without these religious centers, much of the musical heritage of the medieval period would likely have been lost. They served as the fundamental educational bedrock for nearly all formal musical training, shaping not only individual musicians, but also the very trajectory of Western music itself.